All right, let's see if this is working. Can you hear me? All right, good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Sorry about the little delay. I was asked to wait a few minutes as people trickled in from the main stage. My name is Jasser, and I can't tell you how humbling it is and an honor it is to speak at CPAC and join you in this conversation this afternoon. I guess no bigger honor, the only honor bigger than being invited to CPAC is being invited back. So this is my second year here, and things have obviously changed quite a bit, and they've certainly not gotten better in the world of political Islam, ideological battles, domestic and international security. We have 45 minutes together, so what I want to do is spend maybe 20 minutes just giving you a 70,000-foot view of where we are. We've had a major development in the last few months with the formation of our Muslim reform movement, so I'd like to share that with you. And then in the last 20 minutes, open it up to Q&A and have a conversation. So, why are we having this conversation today? The bottom line is that our homeland security is threatened. We've had attacks that have increased exponentially, and it is because, my full-time job is as a doc. I treat patients, and in any disease, if you don't treat the condition but only treat the symptoms, the patient will continue to get worse and the cancer will spread. The cancer is spreading. The West now is part of collateral damage, believe it or not. This is what we've experienced in San Bernardino and Paris. Ottawa and Chattanooga has only been collateral damage to the primary problem domestically that we see in America and Canada and the West, but primarily in the Middle East, where you see a millennial war happening within the House of Islam. I want to orient you a little bit about what our organization is, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and it is not only a think tank, but an activist group that was formed in the wake of 9/11 because we believed that terrorism was a tactic. We weren't fighting terror, we were fighting an ideology that terror is but simply a tip of the iceberg. What is under that? Under that, actually, we believe is a bigger threat. The terrorists you can identify when they grab their weapons and seek to attack something, they become military targets. It's a waste of time to try to fix that problem, and yet our homeland security and your tax money has been focused on countering violent extremism. That is the entire mission right now of both the public and the private sphere has been countering violent extremism. If you don't use that terminology, you are a non-starter in the homeland security realm, be it public or private. And yet, who can define what that is? I mean, countering violent extremism is what we do in gang violence and drug violence and every violence on the planet, and yet when it comes to countering the offshoots of political Islam, or Islamism, if you will, the violent aspects of it which create the ISISes of the world, we yet have no strategy. And the American Islamic Forum, we formed in 2002 after 9/11 because we realized that there were really very few, if any, Muslim organizations that were American and dedicated to reforming against the ideas of the Islamic State. And sadly enough, ISIS has validated our existence 10 years later. And yet, if you look at Muslim organizations, and any of you who I see, some of you who follow our work closely online and elsewhere, you'll realize that I wish only we were followed for our ideas and countered ideologically, but yet when Muslims get upset with what we do, they call us haters, they call us bigots, self-hating Muslims, anything to avoid dealing with the issue of theocracy in Islam. Anything avoiding the issue of the fact that we have a deep need for reform. Anything in order to avoid the parallels of what America went through when it was fighting theocracy, that our founding fathers actually were establishing the greatest country on the planet in its fight against Christian theocracy. And our belief is that Islam is in that same time in history right now, and that terrorism will never go away. Islamist terrorism will never go away unless Islam becomes post-theocratic, if you will, and at least has a pathway away from that. But yet when we get targeted, we're targeted that we are somehow anti-Islam because we fight against the Islamist theocrats. And unfortunately, we've been validated. So the question is that I get asked every day on social media and elsewhere isn't there just one Islam? And when you say one Islam, there's the group that says Islam is peaceful and the radicals are just sort of psychiatric deviants. So that's their one Islam, the peaceful Islam. And then there's the other one Islam that says Zuhdi smoking whatever, or he's some type of mutant and Islam is the problem and you can't reform it, and that's the problem, so there's one Islam. As you all know, as people of faith, I'm sure there are many versions and interpretations of all faiths. So the question, though, is what's the dominant version? And I think many of us reformers realize that, and Ezra Nomani describes it as the honor brigade. There is an honor brigade out there, and go to that hashtag online, honor brigade, in which any of us that talk about the need to reform against the ideas of the leaders of the Islamic community feel that they will protect at any cost those who speak out, because they think Americans are not smart enough to separate political Islam from faithful spiritual Islam. They think that somehow if you use the term Islamism, it'll demonize all Muslims. And it's like treating cancer. They feel the chemotherapy is going to kill the patient, so don't deal with it. Just stay, dumb and ignorant and push it under the carpet and don't confront the problem. But the reality is that Islamism is a theopolitical ideology that you see in almost every Muslim majority country that is devoted to subjugating women, dissidents, minorities, non-Muslims, anyone who disagrees with the government. And if you think the caliphate doesn't exist today, it does exist. It's called the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It's sort of a neo-caliphate. And the reason it's not a quote-unquote caliphate per se is those countries left to their own devices, like Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are both in the OIC, would soon kill each other had they not had a common enemy currently in the West and elsewhere. And we see them attacking each other in hot conflicts, especially in Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere where you see Sunni-Shia conflagrations and sometimes Sunni-Sunni conflagrations. But ultimately, the bottom line is that they divide the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, which is the land of Islam and the land of war. They use terrorism in the land of war because they want to see us lose the appetite for influencing their world. And influencing the Muslim community globally is not about military, it's not about boots on the ground. It's about the ideas of liberty and freedom. And the issue is that it's not only having open exchange, but being critical of folks we consider to be our allies. The Saudis, as a result of our need for oil and our addiction to oil, have been our so-called allies, and yet there's no greater boot camp for ISIS than the country of Saudi Arabia. The country of Saudi Arabia has beheaded more people in the last 6 months than ISIS has, and yet we consider them our allies against ISIS. But yet they're in the house of Islam, and anyone who confronts that fact that they are breeding and producing the future ISISes of the world just doesn't realize that that is the disease. And when we invite them in, when we invite the Saudis or their allies here in America, their lobbyists who are paid by foreign governments or may have alliances with organizations here, when we invite them in to help us, it's like countering drug violence on the streets and inviting the white-collar drug distributors in to help you deal with drug violence on the streets. It's the same ideology, just one's a corporate money-making laundering operation. The other is on the streets, the gangs that push out the drugs and the ideas. Let me start first at home. What does political Islam look like at home? In America, it's going to be hard to find them because there are no religious political parties. In Europe, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood has an office. They have a newspaper they put out. In London, the Muslim Brotherhood exists. And hats off to Prime Minister Cameron, who recently has released a 45-page report I'd ask you all to look for. It was released 3 or 4 months ago. Talked about how directly connected the Muslim Brotherhood political apparatus is in England to radical Islam in Europe and radicalization of Muslims. That is a courage of a connection that I think took too long to make since 9/11, but our government is far behind ever making that. I mean, our government is still using these groups, the Islamist groups in Washington, as advisors for our strategy in countering radical Islam, let alone developing a strategy that realizes they are the font of radical Islam. So what does political Islam look like in America? It's Islamic identity groups. So where you don't have political parties like you do in Egypt, like the Brotherhood or Jamaat Islamiyya in Pakistan, in the West they're going to develop secular-looking faith-based groups that are based in identity movements. So does that mean every Islamic group is Islamist? No. I think the way to tell the difference will be, as I tell you later about our Muslim reform movement, but I think the way to tell the difference is those who will believe that Muslims should vote as a bloc, that somehow we are a race or an identity movement rather than an ideology. If they talk about Islamophobia, what is that? Islamophobia, I mean, sure, there is bigotry against Muslims, but when they talk about Islamophobia, it's a way of invoking blasphemy laws in the West by saying you can't say anything critical about Islam. They use the term Islamophobia rather than talking about, it's like instead of saying anti-Semitism, which is hatred against Jews, they talk about Judeophobia, and that's rarely used as a term. Well, the OIC invoked the term Islamophobia. Why? Because they wanted to prevent the West from getting into this battle of ideas where we can be critical of the current leadership ideology of Islamism. And these groups, be it the Council on American Islamic Relations, who often speaks on foreign media and demonizes groups like ours. And there is a documentary that was done by 9 different Muslim heroes, women who are courageous, that speak out against misogyny and the treatment of women by Islamists. It's called Honor Diaries. They would put out a hashtag called Dishonor Diaries, and yet when pushed on national media, they'd say, oh, there's nothing in the documentary wrong, it's just who paid for it, or it's just how it's being used. You can't have a dialogue about radicalization unless you deal with the reality of the substance, and unfortunately, Islamist groups in America have one mission. Many of them come out of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups, if you will, but their mission is singular, which is to prevent a natural conversation about Islam in America. And they will exaggerate the attacks against Muslims that do happen. Certainly there is bigotry that's being seen in the American political atmosphere today. But what is the way to counter that? Is it by exaggerating it and saying that Muslims are the targets of every act of hate in America, and half of the press releases they release end up being premature and end up being non-related to bigotry? And when you look at the data, you see that anti-Semitism is still at 2 to 3 times the rate of what it is for anti-Muslim bigotry, and yet the bandwidth given in the media to anti-Muslim bigotry is, thanks to the Islamists, exaggerated. And I think the best way to counter bigotry against Muslims is for Americans to see us leading in a patriotic way the battle to reform the ideas, and then the other bigotry will go away. You need to understand Islamism in its most populist, threatening way. It exists in Iran, Khomeini, that's the Shia flavor of Islamism. It exists in Egypt with the Brotherhood. So be it Sunni or Shia, those are divisions and schisms within the theology, if you will. Islamism is the same, be it Pepsi or Coke, Shia or Sunni. It's about political Islam, where the state's identity and its legal construct is run by Sharia law and the interpretation of the Islamist clerics. This I call the neo-caliphate I was mentioning to you, these leaders of 56 Muslim countries. Every one of them in some way or another is a corporate head of an Islamic state. So the only difference between the Muslim Brotherhood, now you look, many of the royal families today now are declaring the Brotherhood terrorist organizations. How is that? Does that mean they're anti-Islamist? No, the difference between the royal families of the UAE, of Qatar or Saudi Arabia and the Brotherhood, they both drink from the same trough of Islamism. But the difference is one believes in a board of directors for Islamists ideology where the one corporate structure runs it, and the other believes it's a grassroots sort of viral chaotic movement, which is what the Brotherhood or other populist Islamists. The ideology, theocracy, is the same. This is a bipartisan problem. We are where we are today, as much as, if you're a conservative, you want to blame the left, and if you're a Democrat, you want to blame the right. This is a bipartisan problem where the royal families, the Islamists, have paid very heavily and handsomely to our presidential libraries and elsewhere in order to silence the universities. We see at Georgetown, the Center for Christian Muslim Understanding is one of the main centers with so-called professors like Nathan Lean and others who will continue to write against us reformers as being the bigots, the Uncle Toms. They use just grotesque language about our work, and yet they never confront the ideas. Why? It's part of the financing operation of the Saudis in order to prevent reformists from having a voice. So what is the solution? These are a couple examples, and I think if you look at Muslim organizations that are dedicated to reform, we, in our American Islamic Forum, have a Muslim Liberty Project. That's a youth-directed project that looks to engage Muslim youth in believing that their American identity, that patriotism, that nationalism gives them a liberty, that first freedom of religious liberty, that is a liberty that will allow them to be more Muslim or non-Muslim, to enjoy or choose their faith as they see fit better than any so-called Muslim country in the world. And I think this is where it's important, where when we talk about refugees, when we talk about solutions, if we don't thread the needle between separating that, yes, there's a problem within the House of Islam, but we need our Muslim youth, we need our Muslim leaders to be part of the solution. If we are imprecise in our language and we mix up saying Muslim with Islamist, you're going to alienate the very people you need to fight the Islamists within. Imagine if our founding fathers, who to their wisdom didn't put the word Christian in our founding documents, but yet we understand this is a very Christian country. And yet they didn't put it because they didn't want that debate about which form of Christianity. I think Islam has to go through that same debate. And to that end, we formed our Muslim Reform Movement, which is bigger than our American Islamic Forum. It's a very diverse, bipartisan effort of reformists that did one major thing, which was this. At the left upper corner there is our Declaration of the Muslim Reform Movement. This is the beginnings of our website at muslimreformmovement.org. We had a press conference at the National Press Club that actually happened to happen one day right after San Bernardino on December 4th. And we had planned this from 6 months in advance. We had a summit from December 2nd and 3rd, 14 organizations, 20 different leaders of different groups. Our organization convened it, brought Muslim leaders in from Denmark, the UK, imams from Canada, from London. We sat, rolled up our sleeves for 36 hours and developed a 2-page declaration. We'd ask you to look at it on our website. And basically it has 9 points to it that we sort of look at as the goalpost at the end of the field. We know we're still on the opposite 1-yard line, but the goalposts at the end of the field are that we believe in the secular state. We reject not only the Islamic State, but all Islamic states. We reject all apostasy and blasphemy laws. We believe in the equality of men and women. We believe the Ummah, which is not, right now currently Ummah in Arabic means Islamic community, but it also means Islamic State. We believe the Ummah includes all humanity, and that is a major reform in Islamic ideology. And we believe that ideas, and at the top of it we put the statement that we think has the most meaning to us, which is that ideas don't have rights, but human beings do, which directly attacks this concept of Islamophobia. Most of the prisons in these countries that we call our allies are lined with individuals that, if I had an organization in Saudi Arabia, I'd be like Raif Badawi, in jail, being flogged by the Saudi government, or many of those who are convicted for blasphemy in Pakistan or other regimes that really prevent the dissent necessary to have these reforms. Take these 9 positions and use this tool. People say, what can we do? We're not Muslim. This is your problem, Zudi. Good luck, and they pat me on the back. Take this declaration. Ask every Muslim you know where they stand on it. We are now pushing this out, mailing it, and following up with phone calls to mosques all over the country. We sent it to 3,000 mosques, and we're sending it to sort of the celebrity Muslims, whoever they are that you may know, that are talking heads on many various networks and newspapers that write, and we're expecting them to respond. Will they sign this? And it's at change.org. We have, I think, a few thousand signatures already. We're asking them, will you sign our declaration? If they sign it, great, they're part of the solution. If they don't, we'd like a reason as to why. One example is one of the imams that participated with us helped us craft this. Went back to Ottawa. His board had a conniption. And after their apoplexy of what they did, he ended up asking that his name be retracted. We then took their response as to why they felt that our attack on monarchies was not appropriate. And they went on and on. So we're posting their response so that it's public. This should be a public debate. If Muslims can't sign on, this is not about terrorism. We understand. I've never met actually a Muslim that believes you can go target restaurants and buses, and those guys are military targets. Take them off the planet, wipe them out, whoever the radicals are. But the ideology of theocracy that is anti-Western and anti-secularism needs to be countered, because that's the supremacism that feeds radical Islam. So just like when we were fighting the Soviets, Would anyone in the Cold War have thought that the Cuban communists or the Latin American communists or South America or China or other forms of communism were somehow our allies against Soviet communism? No, they just weren't our direct enemies at the time. And I think similarly, Islamism, we need to start understanding, and I think especially those of you at CPAC understand what a battle of ideas is all about. And this declaration, we put on our website for this movement an interview that a North Dakota newscaster, I can't remember what channel it was, but he brought in his imam at the mosque in North Dakota, went through some of the things in our declaration. We've never met him, but downloaded our declaration and had a 10-minute interview where the imam, he asked him, what do you think about equality of men and women? What do you think about, hudud laws and punishments based on Sharia? For example, one of our statements is we reject institutionalized Sharia, but we don't reject, obviously, our personal Sharia about diet and practice of prayer, etc. And it was amazing how that became, he didn't have to be an expert. The imam then was on record. He was mumbling through some of it, but ultimately said he didn't disagree with it. And I think that's a way to hold Muslim leaders accountable. Now, some of it he said he didn't know, and I think it goes to show you that a lot of the folks portrayed as leaders in the Muslim community have a lot of work to do. In the last few minutes, and I've talked about some of this, which is if you look, I think one of the core aspects of our founding documents that is the nucleus of where I think Islamic reform needs to come from is sort of this belief in the Establishment Clause. And that does, if you can start helping Muslims believe that you don't have to establish a religion in the state, ultimately that will be the solution to radicalization. These are some of the organizations that exist now that are part of the American Islamist Network. Some of them are related to one another. They have a common origin from the 60s and 70s, which was brotherhood groups, Saudi funding, etc. But ultimately, they've each gone in their own direction. But it's interesting that if you ask them what does democracy mean, democracy to them means elections. And the Egyptians will tell you that basically after, the revolution in 2011 was the definition of mobocracy. And as we know in America, we're a republic, and there's a reason in that ultimately the Supreme Court protects the rights of minorities, and without our separation of powers, we would have a mobocracy, and we deal with that in every election. And I think, the bottom line is that this is, the problem is that many of these groups portray themselves as advocates of democracy, but rarely are they advocates for minority rights, and especially minority rights within the majority Sunni community who believe in dissent. I want to leave you with a diagram that I think, if you look at, I'm going to overlay a complicated diagram onto this. If this sphere is all the Muslim population, and we look from left to right, not left to right politically, but if the left is sort of secular thought, and the right is theocratic thought, okay? Let's overlay, and this is the entire Muslim population. Let's look at some numbers that we can better understand. So again, secular ideas are on the left, theocratic ideas on the right. The population is somewhere in the middle. On the extremes are those who believe that the ends justify the means. So terrorists are those who will do any means possible in order to get their ends. Both sides of the extreme have terrorists, right? Just like in the Palestinian population, you've got Hamas and PLO. And in Syria, you've got Assad, who supposedly is a secularist, but working with Iran. That's a tough pill for me to understand. But he's a secularist, military, national socialist. The Ba'ath is a national socialist party, but they're terrorists as far as every Syrian I know is concerned. So that dark yellow tip, 5 to 10%, same thing on the right. If you look at the Islamist population, 5 to 10% are radical militants that will use terrorism. In the middle is 90% of the Muslim population. So the debate, you see where I have the blue marks, is sort of where the nonviolent majority of Muslims reside. That green ellipse there in the middle, sort of, if you look at populations, most of the Islamist parties got 30 to 40% of the vote the first time around. In Egypt and Tunisia, this hasn't been studied well. It needs to be studied better, but those of us, swimming in only domestic types of funding have not had the funding to do that. But ultimately, that's the type of work we have to do, is figure out what is this movement. And most studies have shown that Islamism is 30 to 40% of the Muslim population. The reason they won elections in Tunisia and Egypt is because they at the end won runoff elections in both countries. They didn't win the majority, but they won runoff elections. The battle of ideas, once this country gets its head on right as far as what we're fighting, is in the middle of this population, between those Muslims floating between the Islamic State idea and liberty and secular ideas. Currently, the secularists are getting decimated by the Islamists because the Islamists portray secularists as dictators, military thugs, socialists, fascists, Arab fascists, etc. That's how they portray non-religious states. There is no third pathway, and I think the majority of Muslims are to the left of the theocrats there, but unfortunately they've not had a voice. So lastly, and then I'll open it up to questions, there are fault lines that you can look at. I think you need to demand, and as you leave here today, demand that your media, government, academia, the NGOs, interfaith community engage Islamism or political Islam, engage the Islamists, whether it be domestically or globally, and provide platforms for reformers to debate the Islamists so that they can't just demonize us, but actually engage us in Lincoln Douglas debates. We have many that we had online with imams, and unfortunately they've sort of figured out that they've been losing these debates, so they've stopped having them with us. But that's the best way. Have a debate between Muslims about, is political Islam a threat? Is there such a thing as Islamic democracy? I believe there isn't. I think that that's a theocracy. But ultimately, that's the debate we need to have. The fault lines of free speech, women's rights, religious freedom, I think that I would ask another thing of you. Put on your mantle somewhere a reminder that we need to pay attention to this, not just for 2 weeks after a shooting, after Chattanooga or San Bernardino, or after some grotesque beheading video that comes out of ISIS. We need to have programs that pay attention to this every day, every week. Just like you have a weather report on news, you need to have a jihad report every day that you start paying attention to, because Islam is not going to reform itself. And the West, the free world, has to get into this debate in order for the Muslim community to begin to feel that there's an urgency for these reforms. And this last bullet is really important. Our security clearances right now do nothing to vet for political Islam. So all I can tell you is that when we were fighting the Soviets, we had hundreds writing questionnaires, figuring out how to do polygraphs, et cetera, and understanding who were communists and who weren't, who might be Soviet sympathizers. And I'm not telling you to resurrect McCarthy-esque type things. No, I'm talking about security clearances here. I'm not talking about shutting down parties. I'm against any shutting down of mosques. I think that doesn't work unless they are violent mosques that have weapons in them, like a few of them in France did. But the French also shut down some mosques that were just preaching hatred. Now, a country that has the Nazi Party and other parties that operate, I think not only would it be illegal, but it is actually counterproductive to push these guys underground. But security clearances, we need to start vetting for allegiance to Sharia states over secular states and liberal states. So 3 major points: understand Islamism, promote liberty. The OIC is the new evil empire of today, and engage Muslim reformers who advocate for liberty. And I'm ready for your questions. Thank you. Yes.
I live in South Jersey, not exactly Muslim attendance. However, I live 15 minutes away from the Islamic Center that Fort Dix terrorists were from. And 1 month ago, the imams from the area invited multi-religious groups to go to an event with them to describe, number 1, the real meaning of their religion and to tell us about that. And number 2, to talk about the radicalization issue. 800 to 1,000 people showed up at the Jewish Community Center, and it was all religions were there. So it started out well. Unfortunately, it didn't end well because they addressed the first half by saying Islam is a religion of peace. ISIS is not Islamic. Neither is Al-Qaeda. Neither is Hamas. Neither is the fundamentalists. And they never addressed the second part. How is their religion spurned all these activities?
So, his question is about, I'm going to repeat the question because we're taping this, but his question was about a mosque near Fort Dix, and they had a Q&A with a speaker about Islam who came in. The response was overwhelming with 1,000 people that showed, but yet they didn't really address the problem. Welcome to my world. I've said this on Fox and CNN and elsewhere that we Muslims need a 12-step program. We do. And what's the first step of the 12-step program is getting past denial, and then calling all the people you hurt and admitting that you've hurt them. And you know, it's interesting. I did a panel which ended up being a debate in Denver, Colorado, where a professor who had been portrayed as a reformer stood up and indignantly pounded as halfway through our talk and said, we have no responsibility to speak against these guys. We believe in American systems, etc. You are trying to put their burdens upon us. And I said, first of all, you really don't understand legacy, in that if it's not Muslims that are going to fix this, then who? You don't really understand the responsibility in living in this beautiful, I mean, my parents' family right now are truly, I mean, talk about carpet bombing. My family in Aleppo right now is living through carpet bombing. The Russians, we spoke to them on Skype, are carpet bombing Aleppo. And not areas where there's ISIS. They are carpet bombing neighborhoods in Aleppo where I know many of you don't feel there's that many moderate Syrians, but there were at the beginning of the revolution, and there still are some. They're bombing neighborhoods that are bigger threats to the Assad regime than ISIS is. They're leaving ISIS pretty much alone. And look at satellite images to bear this out. But when we live in this type of beautiful laboratory of freedom that we have, and these Muslims can't even tell you that they have a responsibility to speak out because either they're afraid or somehow it's bigoted to think they're related to it, it's laziness, ignorance, and nothing I'd want to be associated. It's un-American. Because really, America gives us the laboratory to do this work that nowhere else can. So I would ask you to hold them accountable, to tell them that if their leaders believe, go to the mosque, pick out the books out of the shelves that they're using to teach Islamic law. Most of them will pull out a book called Reliance of the Traveler, which is a book on Sharia that is Shafi'i school of thought, primary schools of thought, that is 13th century based ideology, in which legitimizes the cutting of hands for stealing, the female genital mutilation that Ayan Hirsi Ali speaks about frequently, that many of us talk about, all these things that are part of that Islamic law texts that we need to openly reject in order for America to truly believe that we are moderate, rather than simply the attacks of terrorism and violence. And I think you give them a pass. Interfaith conversations that are just about what we share in common, we're beyond that. You know, that was 9/14/01. That was good to do right after that. This is much later, and the Arab awakening now possesses an opportunity that we need to fight. Yes, in the back.
How much does Saudi Arabia, or do you hold Saudi Arabia responsible for the funding of terrorism? Is it a great deal? Is it half of it?
Saudi Arabia is one of the primary cancer cells on the planet. Their ideology, the text, if you look at most of the translations, when you all send me, I get emails from many of you that, you know, your book talks about a different translation. That's not what these 6 translations, many of them are Saudi translations, Saudi schools. So unfortunately, that little tribe, that desert rat of a tribe that has grown up and been worth billions, has spread an ideology that is Wahhabi, Salafi type Islam, that is Salafi jihadi Islam. If you look at the San Bernardino shooters, they were trained by a school that was out of Pakistan that has connections to the Wahhabi thoughts in Saudi Arabia. So it's all interconnected. Reform-minded Islam, like our Muslim reform movement, needs to start in the West. It can't get Middle Eastern funding. Yes, ma'am. We only have a couple more minutes for questions, and then I was given a signal that we need to wrap up. Yes.
Thank you for taking my question.
Sure.
My question is, with the, our government opening the doors to Syrian refugees coming in, and we know that most of them probably are refugees, but quite a few of them are not. I mean, we know what's happening in Europe. And how can we fight back against the statement or the accusation that we are Islamophobic and we're hate people if we don't want just unlimited immigration to our country? Why aren't these people going to other Muslim countries? Wouldn't they be more comfortable there than here?
Well, okay, so the question is about Syrian refugees and the security threat that it poses. We are going to talk about that on the Saturday panel in the morning. But I will tell you that my response to that has been that we need to put a pause on all immigration, but not just say against Muslim immigration. The Daily Beast, and I say that with family waiting, trying to come here, and I'm trying to figure out a way to get them here, and it's impossible. But, and I will tell you, there is ignorance in thinking that it's just ISIS. The Daily Beast, Tablet Magazine, had a great piece 5 days ago about how Asad Shabiha, which are these thugs of monstrous type gangs, and the Syrian community will tell you that 1 out of 9 Syrians, long before the revolution, were part of the Mukhabarat, which are the intelligence operations, no different than Saddam had. Well, I guarantee you, embedded in the refugees are intelligence operatives of Assad regime, of Russia, of many operatives, Iran, that are not always just Muslim, that could include non-Muslims, that we aren't vetting for. So we have to figure out how to vet for jihadists, which you could use our Muslim Reform Movement declaration and get to the security thing that I was talking about, and also vet against Assadists and Russian operatives. I mean, the Russians have, the Syrian Electronic Army shut down the New York Times, Washington Post. There has been many attacks from Syrian government operatives that aren't ISIS, would also pose a threat, and we have done very little. Now we're saying we do background checks, et cetera, but really in a government that's our enemy, that's going to be very difficult to do. So we do need to improve that, but never, please never change the narrative of the Statue of Liberty, of America being that place for those who seek freedom, because I turned out to be what I am because my parents escaped Syria and came to America, and we can't change what America stands for. I guess we have to shut it down. So thank you.